I recently was down in Tanzania, which is one of our core countries for Oxfam Ireland, and I was there unfortunately because the situation in Burundi has developed very badly. There were presidential elections due in June and also parliamentary elections, and unfortunately this became violent, the protests became violent and sparked a lot of tensions within Burundi. This resulted in some open fighting on the streets. When this happens, it was the public, the ordinary citizens, who got affected most. Some of them were fleeing just from the general violence. They were very much afraid, and they were also, some of them had been refugees previously in the civil war before, and they just really felt afraid that they did not want to be in that situation themselves again. And as a result, many people have crossed over the border into northern Tanzania. We went in May because initially around 30,000 people had moved across the border into a very small crowded beach in a small village called Kagunga, where the only way to get to the rest of Tanzania was via boat. And the conditions for the people was very bad. There was no water, there wasn't enough water, should I say, enough clean water, and not enough sanitation, not enough food. Where this was in northwestern Tanzania, just south of the Burundian border, and all of those people were moved to a camp called Nyarugusu, which is near a town called Kasulu. And as part of Oxfam's response there, I was asked to help set up our emergency programme. And this meant helping to expand the existing water and sanitation network within the camp to accommodate for the expected arrivals. And Nyarugusu went from being approximately the 9th largest refugee camp in the world to being the 3rd in about 2 months. And this is, and even at that, I would say it was probably the most congested, the most packed, with the highest population density. There are international standards for how much space people should be given. The speed with which people were coming and the need to find some kind of housing for them meant that the people were literally right on top of each other. And why this is important from Oxfam's point of view is, again, when you have people so close together, the chances of any diseases crossing over is really high unless they are able to keep clean, unless they've got good clean water, unless they're able to wash their hands, wash their clothes, wash their bodies. All very simple things that we take for granted every day. When we have a shower, when we use the bathroom, we're not thinking about it. But even the amount of water that we're flushing down the toilet every time we use it is more than most people in these camp situations have per person per day. The camp initially had approximately 65,000 people who were already living in there, mostly from the Congo, from previous wars, and also a few thousand Burundians from the civil war about 20 years ago. And then these new people started arriving from Burundi since May. As of this morning, 107,000 more people had moved over, and all have been sent into this camp in Nyarugusu, which was originally designed for 50,000 people and had a perfect water system put in for them that was put in by Oxfam 20 years ago and was maintained by our partner Twesa along the way. And it has now expanded within that short period to almost 173,000 people as of this morning. And this naturally put a lot of strain on the local water resources. It put a lot of strain on the food, on shelter. And my job while there was to try to coordinate Oxfam's response to that. How did we manage to deliver water to them? This was in effect the same as if we had a new town sprang up here in Ireland overnight and you had to put the water system in. With all of the same challenges. Where do you find the water? How do you deliver it to people to get it to their doors so they don't have to travel far, so they're not using unsafe water systems? And everything that was involved with that. These people were coming across the border. Initially they were able to come with some personal items and some of their clothes and kitchen sets, but in the later days, as unfortunately the violence continued in Burundi, they were coming with just about nothing, so really the clothes on their back. So we also had to look into how do we deliver out containers for them to keep water in. Other agencies were giving things like food and so cooking pots and kitchen utensils so people could eat. But our main focus was on the critical area of clean water, good and safe disposal of sanitation, and on public hygiene promotion. And cholera and typhoid are particularly fast at spreading when you have people in a very cramped environment. And particularly if they don't have good clean water, washing hands being the simplest thing. If they can't do that, the chances of a massive outbreak of cholera or of typhoid is very, very high. So our critical issue was to try to get clean water to people, to try to distribute hygiene items, basic things like soap, way to wash their hands, in how to go to the toilet very simply and safely and without having to just go behind a bush, because in a very short time there were no more bushes. They had to all be cleared, and they were either burnt for firewood or had to be removed to make a place for the tents for these people to stay in. So it was a fairly busy, fairly intense time. We were working very much under pressure and against the clock all the time. We did not have the luxury of saying, it's 5 o'clock, let's go home, because the people were there. They still needed this support, and they were constantly coming in. They are even still coming in across the border these days. Tanzania is seen as a very safe area in the region. It's in what we call the Great Lakes part of Africa, which is the area where you have Lake Tanganyika, you have Lake Victoria, both of which border on Tanzania, and Lake Malawi to the south. And it has been a very stable country, surrounded by some fairly unstable countries, like, unfortunately, Burundi, like the Congo next door. So when anything happens there, people like to come across into Tanzania, and they're very welcoming. I find it absolutely fascinating that one of the poorest countries in the world, it isn't the poorest, but it is quite far down on the humanitarian index, and it opened its doors. It did not try to close them. And while we're looking at Europe at the moment, looking at how to keep refugees out of Europe, in Tanzania, they were opening their doors and they were looking to try to see how could they support them. Even since I left there a couple of weeks ago, they've now opened a new camp to try to decongest the Nyarugusu, the original camp, and so give people more space, and also have more space to take more people coming if they need to. I think the bit that hit me most was from when I first arrived in Nyarugusu camp, the 27th of May. People were still arriving. They were being trucked in. There were over 2,000 people a day being trucked in, and they pretty much had nothing. They'd been separated from anything they'd owned because they needed to be put into buses, and trucks were coming later with their items. And so they had no food. And there were these long lines of people. They were being provided food by UNHCR, WFP, and our partner TWESA. And they were cooking food for them and dishing it out. And it was like a porridge. Very nutritious. It's given out in a lot of circumstances. But there were these long lines of people just waiting to get their meal. And because they didn't have their personal utensils, they were sharing amongst them, and they were using anything they could get to have the food put into it. And it was being dipped into it 1 cup per person. So if a family was getting it, there were 5 people, they were getting a container big enough, having 5 cupfuls put in, and then they were having to pass it amongst them. And that really struck me. It was quite a difficult thing to see. But it was when I saw one man who was on his own. He finished his, and he then went down the queue to the last person who didn't have anything. Not to the very end, but he followed down until he came to the first person who didn't have anything, and he gave them what he had just eaten out of so that they could eat. But it was that generosity that even in their hardship, these people were willing to share with each other to make sure that they could get food each. I actually met that man again several weeks later, and he was able to take me to where he was staying now, and he had set up a little barber business. When he'd got his items back that he'd come across with, he had a razor that was powered by solar energy, and he set up a little business, barbering. So he was, insofar as you can be in such an environment, he was trying to make his life normal again. And I was really struck by that. I suppose the thing that keeps me most motivated while I'm on one of these missions is the team that I'm working with. It is seeing that we are working together, that we are achieving something. Part of me also is, I'm a very practical person, so physically being able to see the number of latrines that we've dug in a day, physically seeing the number of tap stands or the length of pipe or putting up a tank, so that you can actually see that this morning this thing was not here. It gives you a measure that you are actually achieving what you need to. It is much harder when you're dealing with something that has no visible outcome, or something that takes a long time before. So if we had to, say, order something, it takes a couple of weeks to arrive. In those couple of weeks you feel like you've achieved nothing. But when you're physically building, and this means putting down the water network, putting out the tap stands, putting up the tanks, we had to drill a new borehole, so even seeing the drill rig comes in, while you know there's a lot more to do, you're able to at least say, we got this much done today. Now, you will then always turn around and you say, there's still this much more to do, but there's always tomorrow. We have this plan, we are ready for tomorrow. And I suppose in many ways, for me, it is that physical measure of what we've done in a day that I can look at and say, yes. And I can see people using the latrines we dug for them, using the hand washing facilities afterwards, so that I know not only have we physically dug that, but our team's teaching people how to use it. They've worked, they've been effective, and people's lives are getting a bit better.